Our economy is in a real mess. We can't fix it until we understand what the economy looks like today, how the economy works, and what happens when we change the rules of the game. Let's imagine that these 10 chairs represent all the wealth in the United States. That means everything that people and companies own, like money in the bank, stock, land and buildings, and equipment, minus any debt that we owe. So net wealth equals what we own minus what we owe. And each of our chairs represents 1/10 of all the wealth in the country. These little guys sitting in the chairs represent all the families in the country. Each guy equals 1/10 of that population. In this picture, everyone has wealth. Everyone has the same amount of wealth. But that's not how things are or how they have ever been. Here we are back in time about 100 years ago when a few families owned a lot of this country. When 10% of the families owned 70% of the wealth. What did that look like? Well, we're going to have to move a bunch of people out of their chairs because someone else owns them. Come on, crowd in there, little guys. You've got to share the leftovers. There's only 3 chairs for all of you and 7 for you. And the top 1%, the very richest families, own 40% of all the wealth. At that time, rich people could pile up their wealth and pass it on from generation to generation because there was no estate tax. They didn't pay a lot of income tax, and there was no corporate tax. And there were no rules that could stop people from owning, controlling entire industries and creating monopolies. In those days, people called those rich folks robber barons. And this small handful of families, the top 1%, controlled pretty much everything in the economy from banking to industry. And just when people thought things couldn't get any worse, it did. That's right, the Great Depression. Banks failed, businesses shut down, people lost their jobs, their homes, their dignity. And at that time, there was nothing. No unemployment insurance, no federal aid, no social security, nothing for people to fall back on. The economy was in a terrible state, and there was a lot of human suffering. That huge crisis woke our government up to the idea that the economy isn't just for rich people and that government has a role. After the Depression, the government adopted a new economic strategy called Keynesian economics, named after a British guy named John Maynard Keynes. His economic ideas are also called demand-side economics. Demand side is based on the idea that the engine of the economy is lots of little guy consumers going to work and then using their paychecks to buy products and services. That kind of economic activity is what economists mean when they say demand. What did these demand-side policies look like? After the Depression, Congress wanted wages to go up. So they created a minimum wage and the right for workers to organize around pay, benefits, and working conditions through unions. Over the years, those unions were able to negotiate better pay and pensions for retirement. That way, when the country's productivity increased, and it did, for the next 40 years, it wasn't just corporate profits and CEO salaries that went up, but ordinary workers' paychecks as well. As time went on, these policies helped redistribute our chairs. Union workers could afford to buy homes and have a pension. So that guy over there could earn a chair in his lifetime. Have a seat, sir. Relax. You deserve it. Congress also wanted to make sure that all the chairs wouldn't keep stacking up for a few rich families. So they taxed estates, created progressive income taxes, and started to tax corporations. And they created the first social safety net programs like unemployment insurance and Social Security. Hey, you over there with all the chairs. Now you're going to have to give up 2 of them to taxes so that the rest of the people in the country can have a decent life. Demand side created an active role for government in the economy. The decade after the Depression, we had World War II. Corporations made a lot of money in the war, but they gave some back in taxes. Corporate taxes went up to 50% and stayed there after the war. That economy helped pay for the GI Bill so returning vets could go to college and afford to buy a home. Let's give each of the 2 returning World War II GIs a chair. Have a seat, gentlemen. Getting an education and owning a home are 2 of the most important ways that people can move from no chairs to a stable middle-income slot in the economy. See how the economy looks different now? People are closer together. There's less concentration of wealth at the top. More people have chairs, even though we haven't at all talked about race and gender. This is before the advances of the civil rights and women's movement. But economic policy still matters. Our African-American GI can't buy a house in the suburbs because of racism, but he can still buy a home in a black neighborhood and get financial support to go to college. These policies survived for 40 years. In the 1960s, the war on poverty invested money in our cities, and the government also passed civil rights legislation. The gap between the rich and the poor got smaller and smaller. By the 1970s, our country had the smallest gap between the rich and the poor than at any other time. Let's give another guy a chair. Then our country changed its mind and switched gears, so stay tuned as our story continues and we learn about another set of rules called supply side economics.